Welcome to a special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Federal-provincial relations have been one of the top themes of 2019. There was the so-called resistance to Justin Trudeau and his federal carbon tax, a fight that continues into the new year. Then there are pipelines, or lack thereof, a near constant source of friction between Ottawa and some landlocked oil-rich provinces. And now the results of the federal election expose deep regional divisions that the federal government has promised to address. All year, we've assessed and analyzed these stories with the people who know what it's like to lead provinces, a segment we like to call the Premier's League. Of course, then, that we convene the Premier's League for a look ahead to what could be some of the biggest political minefields in 2020. Christy Clark was BC's Premier from 2011 to 2017. She's now Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones and joins us from Vancouver. Over in Toronto, Bob Rae was Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 95. He's also former interim leader of the Federal Liberal Party and currently host of the Political Stripes podcast. And here next to me in studio, Premier of P.E.I. from 2007 to 2015, Robert Giz, now President and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Vashi.
Nice to see you. Thanks for lending us so much of your time. Let's get started with an issue that's sure to put some pressure on politicians at all levels of government.
I'm not going to let Justin Trudeau push us out of our country, of which we are proud members.
There is a fire burning here in the Prairie provinces. What I am doing with handing the Prime Minister this letter, this opportunity, is handing him a fire extinguisher, and I'm asking him not to show up with a gas can.
If you are so opposed to the energy that we produced in Alberta, then why are you so keen on taking the money generated by the oil field workers in this province and across Western Canada? You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Pick a lane.
Yes, I do think that it is ultimately their intention to, as to quote the Prime Minister, phase out the oil sands. And as the Prime Minister noted on election night, he wants to be there for Alberta and Saskatchewan, recognizing there are some real tensions in the Federation.
Certainly, our government heard from Alberta a strong message in the election.
I came with real opportunities for us to engage on behalf of the people that I represent in that province. Opportunities that I was hoping to work with the Prime Minister and the new federal administration, the minority government that we have in our nation here today. I did not hear a willingness to work on those priorities. And where there are opportunities for us to expand our provincial autonomy, we're going to look at them very seriously.
Prairie alienation, you might have guessed it, is our first point of discussion. Even though the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion just got underway, and we've seen some slightly toned-down rhetoric from Premiers Kenney and Moe since those clips, Western frustration and Prairie alienation continue. Deputy Prime Minister and Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland headed west as her first order of business after her role changed in the new cabinet. Ms. Clark, I'm going to start with you. How I guess, the effort being made by the federal government, how successful do you think it is or will be?
Well, I think Chrystia Freeland is the right person for the job. She's very, very good, very skilled, likable, trustworthy in my estimation. Though, you know, the problem is that we know from the last 4 years of the same government that the Prime Minister's office really doesn't give ministers very much leash. And so it's really a question of, is the Prime Minister ready to start to, kind of lay down the weapons and stop the fight? Because what they decided to do with climate change back in 2015 was they wanted to fight climate change by having a war with the provinces. That's never going to work in Canada. So I think we've seen them start to back down a little bit on their ideological approach to climate change, recognizing Alberta and Saskatchewan are all, everybody wants to do something. I think that we're starting to see them talk a little bit more, kind of collegially. Proof will be in the pudding, though, too. And remember, this is not just about the climate change file. It is not just about the failure of the federal government to really get pipelines to the West Coast. It is also about the fiscal unfairness that Western Canadians see happens in Canada and has been happening since we joined Confederation all those many years ago. And there, I think Jason Kenney, loyal, patriotic Canadian, says it very well. Look, don't say you want Western Canada's money, but you don't want to help us continue to produce more of it, because that's a recipe for disaster, not just for the West and not just for Western feelings about the rest of the country. It's a disaster for healthcare. It's a disaster for all the programs that Canadians depend on, which are paid for largely by revenues from Ontario and from the West.
Is that argument, Mr. Ray, do you think resonating at the federal level? And if the federal government is tasked with providing some sort of olive branch or olive branches to provinces that are feeling this way, what should those look like?
Well, I think first of all, we need to come to some kind of a consensus over time. It's going to take a lot of discussion about how to get the pipelines done. And at the same time, how to really start a serious transition, which the rest of the world is going through. We're not the only ones facing this crisis. It's being faced all around the world, which is how do we get to a steady reduction in carbon emissions, because carbon emissions are what is causing climate change, and climate change is posing it's going to pose a real challenge to future generations. This is not an easy topic to deal with in a short short episode, but it does require the federal government to listen to those provinces that are producers, not just on the West Coast but also on the East Coast, and for everybody to understand that as Canadians, we're not going to miraculously solve the climate change issue on our own. This is a global problem. It's going to require global solutions. But as far as Canada is concerned, we need to come to some kind of agreement about the need to complete pipelines which we've not yet been able to complete. At the same time, to look at how we can make the whole business more sustainable from an environmental standpoint, and then the issue of how do you divide up the spoils. That's been a debate in Canada for a long, long time. And so I think we have to be prepared for the fact that the provinces are always going to come to the federal government and ask for more money. But this is, I think, a challenge which we need to face up to. But I think we're up to it. And if you ask me, do I think the Prime Minister and the ministers get the message? My answer is yes, I think they do. From everything that I've seen and heard, I think they do get the message.
Do you think they get the message, Mr. Giz?
Yes, I think they're hearing it loud and clear, but we need to realize that Canada is a large, complex country with a lot of different interests from the Atlantic to central Canada to west to the north, and finding that balance is not always easy. If Justin Trudeau wanted to put oil and gas in his top three speaking points of TMX and getting oil to market, it may not sell so well in different regions. So I think that what we need to do is try to make sure that we let all Canadians understand how we all benefit from those things. And Premier Kenney had some good points there. Now, I would like to say a different style may be better. Rhetoric is always good when you're playing to your home base and you're in your own province. But if you want to get things done with the federal government, insulting them is probably not the best approach to take. I would want to take a more collaborative approach. How can you work together, find those compromises, and move forward? And I think we saw at the ministers' meeting today where they came out and, yes, there was no decision made, but they felt that they were listened to, and Premier Kenney and Mo thought that they were listened to after the election. So there is a lot of work to do over the next couple of years.
Let me just quickly follow up with you and then I'll move on. But when it comes to, that's like subtracting the politics out of it completely. I take your point, and obviously, Canadians want something to get done, but the Prime Minister, in making certain decisions or the way in which he says things, is appealing to certain people, and so are premiers of those. There's politics involved in the way they interact with each other all the time.
Absolutely. It's the most
You may know something about that.
It's the hardest thing to do as a politician and as a political leader, as Christy and Bob will know, but evidence-based decision-making and thinking long-term versus short-term political consequences or rewards that you may get. And there's got to be a balance there. And I think Bob's right. You look at our oil and gas industry that we have in Canada today, it is a major benefiter for all of Canada. And all of Canada benefits from that. How can we help them out while at the same time combat climate change that's taking place at the same time? I do think there is a balance. We're 2% of global emissions. It has to be a worldwide solution, as Bob indicated. But at the same time, we cannot not take advantage of the resources we have to help deliver those social programs that go from tip to tip in our country.
Christy, Ms. Clark, I'll give you the last word here,
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it is true. Politicians obviously have to find a balance because they have to get reelected and they have to, kind of run the economy at the same time. There are two things, though, that I would add. One, politics also often requires politicians to be brave. And that means to step outside what might be politically comfortable in order to do what's good for the country. And that's something we haven't seen for the last 4 years. And it's something we need to see a lot more of. I mean, people don't just want politics as usual, where it's politicians deciding how they're going to win. And we've had 4 years of the most political government in my lifetime. We need a government that is going to now decide to set the politics aside and to actually lead the country with an economic vision. And that, I think, is going to be really tough. I don't think it's going to be impossible, though. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed. They've got another 4 years ahead of them. And I really hope we'll see some economic vision and some economic leadership that's been lacking so far.
What you just said reminded me to ask you as we go to break. We have lots more to discuss, but your name has been talked about a lot to lead the Conservative Party. Thought I'd take the opportunity and ask you, are you considering it?
Well, I used to be a Liberal leader.
You did. This is true.
That was a mixed party.
That hasn't stopped anyone from saying that you might run.
It's true. Our party was always a coalition of Liberals and Conservatives in British Columbia, a little bit like they are in Quebec. So here's what I'll say. I'm going to India for a week. And I'm going to go to India and think about all the great things that could be in my future. I think there are a lot of them that would be maybe more relaxing than being the leader of a federal party.
But you haven't ruled it out.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really thinking about it at the moment anyway. I'm kind of, my son's home from university. It's Christmas, for heaven's sake. So
That was a political answer, so I'll still go with you, Vassy. She hasn't ruled it out.
I still haven't heard the word no.
Exactly.
Had a decision, a split decision in the province of Saskatchewan recently. We are taking that forward. We're taking that forward to the Supreme Court of Canada. We saw an intervention announcement here this morning in Quebec. Also believes this is an infringement in provincial jurisdiction, of which we also believe the federal government is in an area that isn't theirs to ultimately operate.
We decided to go with the Supreme Court to contest the jurisdiction of the federal government. We disagree with the federal government trying to impose his way of taxing carbon.
The right thing for us to do is wait and see what the Ontario Appeal Court decides. We can take both of those decisions into account as to whether or not to launch our own separate challenge.
This carbon tax, it's not going to be the courts that are going to decide. The people are going to decide when the election's held.
I can't, ignore the obvious here. The country has spoken, but the message is clear. I mean, people have voted for a carbon tax, even in New Brunswick.
That cover speaks to the power of Photoshop. But if the federal government will listen to the unified voices of premiers from across this beautiful country on economic competitiveness, take steps to make the improvements that we've recommended, they can lessen the resistance remarkably.
How to deal with the effects of climate change has been a flashpoint between the federal government and some provinces ever since the Liberals introduced their Pan-Canadian plan in 2016. The federal plan imposed a backstop on any province that didn't implement its own carbon price starting in 2018. Despite a promise to reimburse money collected to the provinces and territories, the federal government found itself facing legal challenges by Saskatchewan and then later Ontario. Other provinces like Alberta and New Brunswick and even Quebec are questioning federal jurisdiction in this matter. Mr. Ray, I'm going to start with you, and I want to pick up on a point that Ms. Clark made in the last segment, and that is sort of the characterization of initially the federal government being very heavy-handed in the way that it dealt with this issue and less so now. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think so. I think the key thing is a couple of things. First of all, the Supreme Court of Canada will make an important decision. I don't think by any means it's a slam dunk either way in terms of how the court will look at this issue. I think if the court decides that the federal government has the jurisdiction, then I think there will be some serious discussions between the provinces and the federal government about how to go forward, because everyone will recognize that this is not a legal question anymore. This is now a purely political and economic question, and that's really where the governments can do some horse trading and try to find some answers and some solutions. I think a solution is there. I think on the other hand, if the court says no, there's no jurisdiction, then you're kind of back to square one, because most economists, I think, around the world say, and certainly that's been the position that British Columbia has taken, it's pretty hard to help us in what I call this transition without some kind of pricing mechanism. If you want to reduce consumption in some areas, most people think price plays a role. But I've never been one of those people who says, you know, the goal is a carbon tax. No, the goal is to start to make the transition, to get to a point where we're actually reducing carbon emissions and get to a point where we're actually beginning to play our part in this world effort to get to net zero by 2050. I think it's doable, but I think if the Supreme Court of Canada rules against the federal government, I think it'll be a major defeat for the government because they've put so much effort into this pricing issue. And if in fact that's not what happens, then we're going to have to look at other mechanisms, other ways of getting us to a better point. I do think Canadians on the whole, I think a significant majority of Canadians want to reach a compromise that allows us to go forward economically, but also allows us to become more sustainable. It's as simple as that. That's where Canadians want their politicians to be across the country. And I think the sooner we get there, the better off we're all going to be.
Mr. Giz, do you anticipate this remains the same point of friction that it has for the past year, or does it depend largely on what the court determines, as Mr. Ray points out?
Well, I think it's diminished somewhat since the election campaign. You've heard Premier Higgs. You've heard even that comment before was from Premier Ford. That was prior to the election. Well, Ontario's kind of made a decision there. But I think we will have to wait to see what happens with the courts. But there's different provinces contesting it for different reasons. You know, Quebec, it's about jurisdiction. Other provinces is about making sure they don't have a carbon price on carbon. But I want to go back, you know, to Christy, and that is that British Columbia did show leadership, did show vision, came in with the first carbon pricing in Canada. What happened to their economy after they introduced that? Well, it was good government, but you know, the economy kept going up. But where I think, and this is what I talked about before, is that balance. So yes, carbon pricing, according to most economists in the world, is something good. As Bob said, it's going to lead to less consumption is for things that contribute to fossil or to global greenhouse gas emissions. But I think we also need to look for that balance, that we have resources in Canada that are still needed in Canada and around the world. So what can the federal government do to perhaps say, support me on the price on carbon, while at the same time, I'll help you get your products to market? And that's what I'd like to see, because I think then
there are some people who say, though, that's at odds with each other.
They do, but then I go back to, you cannot put your head in the sand. You know, you need to look at what Bob just said, and that is the economy and the environment at the same time. And I think there is some compromises that can be made, I hope, in that manner, because I still want to see Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador do well, because I know when they do well, Prince Edward Island does well, Ontario does well. So, you know, but we all contribute to greenhouse gases, so that's why the carbon pricing across the country is something that I think is a good idea as well.
You are a federalist, as you once said on this show, I believe. Ms. Clark, what do you think?
Well, you know, first of all, on the carbon tax, it matters how you do it. So, Rob, thank you for pointing out British Columbia's economy, fastest growing in Canada while we had a carbon tax. But the thing was, it was revenue neutral. So what we did, we took every penny that was collected from the carbon tax and pumped it into cutting taxes somewhere else. So personal income taxes, small business taxes, corporate taxes. So there was no net new tax burden for people, which is a very profoundly conservative idea, because it's a tax that you have some choice over whether or not you choose you're going to pay it, depending on what kind of fuel you want to consume. Rest of the country, that didn't happen. Didn't happen in Alberta, didn't happen in Ontario, didn't happen in Quebec. And so they just dumped it on top of the rest of the economy. That's a big problem with the federal conservative or the federal Liberals carbon tax. Another problem, though, is this idea that
Can I interrupt you for one second, though? Isn't it revenue neutral, though? That's what they spin it, at least for 80% of Canadians, right? That's what their message is, that you'll get a rebate that essentially makes it revenue neutral. Are you saying that it isn't because it doesn't go to cutting other taxes?
Well, it's kind of revenue neutral, but remember, this is their temporary solution. They're in Ontario or in Quebec and Alberta and other provinces that already had it. if you've already got a carbon tax and you're just dumping it on top of the rest of the economy, which British Columbia is now doing, there's no rebate that comes with that. I mean, my point is the federal government, when they wanted to impose the carbon tax or wanted to all provinces to impose carbon taxes, they didn't say it needed to be revenue neutral. They didn't think about what impact it was going to have in the economy. They said to provinces, do it how you want, do it British Columbia's way, give all the money back, do it Alberta's way, keep all the money and just grow government spending. That is a terrible way to do a carbon tax, and it's part of the reason you've seen such pushback from provinces across the country.
Mr. Ray is shaking his head.
Well, no, I'm only shaking my head because there's a dual message here. I mean, I think what the federal government tried to do was to say, look, we want to be very flexible. If you've already got a carbon tax, there's no, contrary to what Christy said, there's no piling on top. There is no...
There is, though, Bob.
No, there isn't.
Of course there is.
No, there isn't.
Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec all just took the carbon tax and added it as a new tax to the economy. They didn't cut any other taxes off.
But they get a rebate.
You weren't listening to what I was saying.
Okay, finish your point, Mr. Ray.
If you're going to be contemplating life in India, just think of what I'm saying here. British Columbia led the way on carbon taxes and led the way on tax neutrality, both of which are good things. Other provinces, Quebec and Ontario, did this cap and trade system, which Ontario has now pulled out of. I think what the dilemma the federal government had was we got to recognize that some provinces are moving ahead, other provinces are not, and so we've got to try to create a national plan that takes into account what each province is doing, so that in fact in Alberta, the federal government has actually reached an agreement with Alberta to say, well, if you do this on your emissions tax, then we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt with respect to the whole plan. Now
since the election.
But that's an important step, and that is of course a response to the message from the election. But let me just make it clear. I think one of the mistakes that's been made is to make the carbon tax as if that's the objective. We must have a carbon tax. The answer is no. What we must have is a reduction in emissions. We think that taxes and pricing of emissions is part of the puzzle, but we're quite flexible in listening to, well, how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? And how are we going to reach our targets? Canada has a certain lack of credibility here internationally. We signed agreements going back to the 1990s, and we have not met any one of the targets that we set for ourselves.
Nor are we currently on track.
No, nor are we. So there is an issue here about saying, well, come on, if we're really serious about recognizing that this is a problem, we got to figure out a way to do it. I think as I said, if the Supreme Court says the federal government has the power to do what it's doing with respect to carbon prices, then I think at that point there is lots of room for give and take between the federal government and the provinces as to how this is done. And there'll be lots of opportunity to talk about price neutrality in terms of the net impact on the consumer. That can all happen.
Conservatives have put Justin Trudeau on notice. And Mr. Trudeau, when your government falls, Conservatives will be ready and we will win.
Canadians sent a pretty clear message. A clear message tonight that they want a government that works for them, not for the rich and the powerful, not for the well-connected.
We can make a really significant contribution in a minority parliament, and we will.
And to Canadians in Alberta and Saskatchewan, know that you are an essential part of our great country. I've heard your frustration, and I want to be there to support you. Let us all work hard to bring our country together.
We're in an extraordinary time. 4 of us sit before you as leaders of minority governments. We look to Ottawa where there's a minority government. I find, and I think my colleagues in the minority situations would agree, that this is a unique opportunity for us to work together, regardless of where we live in the country, regardless of how we vote.
Mr. Giz, I want to start with you because I think it was Jean Charest who I interviewed a few weeks ago, or maybe just after the election, and he talked about the increased power of premiers in minority situation. Do you agree? Do you think that there is sort of increased leverage there?
There can be, absolutely. I think it's going to be an interesting time, especially after the current crew who's been in power for the last 4 years, now moves into a much different situation. Now, they do have a very strong minority government. I don't think anyone really wants an election right now, or anyone's even prepared for an election. But I think when it comes down to decision making now, you're going to have the federal Liberals are going to have to find a dancing partner for pretty much every issue that they want to undertake. So you've got the Conservatives that have a strong base in the West. You've got the Bloc now, who's going to probably play its biggest role since going back to 1993. And I think that it's going to be up to the federal Liberals to be able to find a way to make decisions on a piecemeal effort while collaborating with those other parties. And they can help do that by getting different premiers on side on issues that will have some say or some leeway within those specific federal parties. I don't think there's going to be as many things that are going to happen as people think. You know, we saw yesterday a $20 billion deficit. We know the Conservatives are basically the polar opposite of what the NDP are. So, you know, while there's going to be some big debates around pharmacare and different things like that, I think you're going to see things watered down to a certain extent. There's going to be a lot of compromises, and it's going to be a very interesting 2 to 3 years. I'm
That's
going
your
to guess.
bet? Yeah.
That's my guess for now.
Ms. Clark, how do you think the minority mandate potentially impacts the relationship of the federal government with premiers?
It's not clear to me that it really will. I think the makeup of the provincial governments is, you know, as Rob pointed out, is going to have an impact for sure. Having a you know, kind of a sovereigntist government in Quebec, having a kind of actually a fairly friendly government in British Columbia. I mean, there's a lot of overlap ideologically between the New Democrats here and the federal Liberals in Ottawa. But you know, what we see in the prairies too, lots of angry premiers. I would say very strong minority government for the federal Liberals. The NDP don't want to topple this anytime soon. So I think you're going to see them in pretty good shape. I think, though, they are going to, and I understand from talking to, you know, some of their members, they are not treating this as though it's a majority government. They are treating this as though it's all campaign, all the time. And that means, sadly, at a time when I really, as I said, think we need leadership and visionary, bold, brave decisions by our federal government, I think we're going to instead get a much more political government even than we had for the last 4 years. And that's a very, very, they set a high bar for partisanship in the last 4 years. It'll be a shame to see them, you know, if that's the path they have to travel down again.
Aren't potentially all minority governments, though, Mr. Ray, inherently extra political? I mean, isn't the possibility of an election always something on the forefront, or is this case, should it or could it be a bit different given what Ms. Clark and Mr. Giz outlined as you know, a very strong minority?
Well, I think what we talked about in the first half of the program is important to bring into this discussion. The fact is that a lot of the issues that we face as a country now do affect the federation. They are issues about federalism. They're about how do we make this country work better. And it's important for everybody to understand that we are a federal country, which means the provinces have real jurisdiction and they have real power and they have real responsibilities. And this has to be borne in mind, and particularly as we're going through some of these issues around resources, which are for the most part owned by the provinces. We're looking at interprovincial pipelines, which affect how we go. We're looking at Indigenous issues, which touch obviously the federal jurisdiction, but also affect the provinces in terms of how things actually get done on the ground. We're looking at money in terms of how things are shared. We're looking at taxes and transfer payments. You can't bring in a program like pharmacare without the participation of the provinces. It's an illusion to think that you can just introduce a new holus bolus federal program and that the provinces will all line up and say, yes, what a wonderful idea. That isn't going to happen, and you need to come to grips with that. So I personally think that once the Conservatives get their act together and Christie comes back from India and tells us what she's going to do, and you know, Rona Ambrose tells us what she's going to do, and we get clarity on that situation, I think we'll be having a very different conversation when we have a new federal Conservative leader who might be quite popular. and who might have a basis for trying to talk to the premiers and talk about this question where, how are we going to actually make the Federation work more effectively? And that will, I think, create a discussion point for the country. Right now, I don't think anybody's predicting that the government's going to collapse. It's interesting. Alan Blakeney used to say to me, he said, the best politics is the best policy, and the best policy is the best politics. And I just wish that were true. And
I was
because
say,
I think
is that true?
Well, but I think it's such a positive way of trying to look at it. I think there is too much partisanship in politics. I think there is too much messaging. I think there is too much, constant, trying to send out a message today. We're almost in a kind of post-truth era globally when it comes to politics and political messaging, and that troubles me a lot as a citizen. It really bothers me that we're at this stage in the political dialogue. I hope the federal government can rise above it, and I hope that the provinces can too. But in response to what Christy said, I mean, go back to the tapes that you played at the beginning of the program where premiers are threatening to break up the country. They're saying that, that there's a fire going on and, don't put any gasoline. I mean, there's a lot of incendiary language. It would be great if you could just lower the temperature a bit, just kind of get at some of these issues.
The past few weeks.
And I think we're beginning to see that, and that's a very positive thing. And I think that as that starts to come in, I think you're going to see a fairly stable situation. There's 2 or 3 things that can change it. One, obviously, is a scandal, events, things you can't predict, which always happens in politics. And the second is the economy. If the economy stays reasonably strong, as the federal government is predicting, then, there won't be as much pressure on all governments. But once the economy starts to really show signs of pressure, as it is in some provinces and as it is affecting some provincial governments, it can have a real impact on the federal government and on the stability of the federal government. As soon as there's a party that thinks it can win an election, then the whole minority situation becomes less stable. Right now, I wouldn't say it's anybody's game, but at some point, a party may say, if we pull the plug, we're going to get a mandate. And that's always the risk that you run in a minority situation.
We believe that these tariffs need to be lifted. They need to be lifted for the benefit of both of our countries.
Hopefully Congress will approve the USMCA quickly, and then the great farmers and manufacturers and steel plants will make our economy even more successful than it already is, if that's possible.
We have accomplished this together at a moment when, around the world, it is increasingly difficult to get trade deals done.
And the result, I think, is the best trade agreement in history.
What are you at? What is your number?
We are increasing significantly our defense spending from previous governments that cut it.
Okay. Where are you now in terms of your number?
1/4. And continuing to move forward.
They're getting there. They know it's important. Well, he's two-faced. But, the truth is that I called him out on the fact that he's not paying 2%, and I guess he's not very happy about it.
We were all surprised and I think pleased to learn that the next G7 will be at Camp David. I think that was an unscheduled announcement, and I think everyone's team, every different leader has teams who every now and then have their jaws drop at unscheduled surprises, like that video itself, for example.
Ms. Clark, I'm going to start with you. A bit of a two-parter here. First, your reaction to NAFTA being a done deal again, and obviously still awaiting ratification, but at the point it is at right now. And then the second part of the question is around your assessment of the relationship between our two countries at this point.
Well, I think getting NAFTA done is a great thing for Canadians. I mean, when Brian Mulroney signed the free trade agreement, I was in university at the time, and I remember there was massive opposition to it. And it turned out to be a great deal for Canada. It massively increased our trade wealth and the jobs in the country, our GDP. It was probably the biggest economic change we've had in 100 years. This renewing it is good for Canada. I recognize it's not perfect. Lumber's not in. Steel, I don't think, is still in. We've got a bunch of things that still need to be cleaned up, but it's better than not having it. But here's our problem. We have a big competitive problem on the tax side and the regulatory side with the United States. So while jobs are growing in Canada, they're growing way faster in the United States. While we see some, economic growth happening here, we see the American economy growing faster as well. So we have to be thinking about competitiveness on the regulatory and tax side, not just about NAFTA. And in terms of the relationship between the two countries, I'm going to say I just think it's very hard for any leader of any country to try and figure out where the American system is at right now. President Trump, the Senate, the Congress, the Democratic primaries, it's really difficult to have any kind of predictable relationship with the Americans. And so, are we worse off than we used to be with the Americans? Probably. Is everybody else amongst our allies? Probably.
Very fair point. Mr. Giz?
Yeah, well, to quote a famous politician, I think this is a great deal. I'm glad we got a deal done on this. I predicted a number of years ago that we would. It would take some growing pains, but we would get there. And I agree with Christie's assessment. And when we talked about bold leadership and evidence-based decision-making, you look back to the Brown-Mulroney years where I think there was actually a lot done back in those times, and Bob had the experience of working with Mr. Mulroney back then, but free trade is something that is extremely important for all of Canada. The U.S. is our largest trading partner. We need to have these deals done. It helps grow the economy, create jobs. On the relationship front, I would say that Chrystia Freeland will go down as perhaps one of the greatest negotiators in Canadian history, probably up there with Prime Minister Mulroney. And she's worked under more difficult circumstances, and our Prime Minister is put under difficult circumstances as well at times. But who knows what's going to happen after the next election in the U.S. But I think when you look at the cards that we were dealt, they were not great cards, but we came out with a winning hand.
Mr. Ray?
Yeah, I think the key problem now is going to be how do we deal with the various protectionist crises that we have from time to time. It's the unpredictability of the administration of the agreement that's a problem. If somebody wakes up on the wrong side of the bed on any issue, you don't know whether you're going to get hit or you're not going to get hit. It's very unpredictable. But I think the government, frankly, has done a remarkable job at managing what is a very challenging relationship at the moment. But it's also a very important relationship for us. And yeah, there's economic realities. We constantly have to recognize the competitive challenges that we face around the world, not just with the Americans. But I do think the government deserves some considerable credit for having managed this relationship so well. This has been a hugely difficult file for any government, and they have done well with it. And I think it's important for Canadians to take a moment and just reflect on that.
Ms. Clark, I have just a minute left. Your thoughts on the significance of the relationship for provinces as well, because provinces had a real vested interest in these negotiations.
Yeah, well, I think the federal government, and Prime Minister Harper started this. He got we were consulting as part of the CETA deal that they did with the Europeans. And there's been a lot of consultation, I understand, around NAFTA as well with provinces, which I think is really good ultimately for us. Unfortunately, though, for British Columbia, lumber is still outside the NAFTA deal. And while we don't necessarily want it in, it's a huge part of many provinces' economy out in the east and in the west. And we do need to get that settled too. It's not just a loose end. It's a pretty important part for Canadian jobs.
Can't depend on the WTO right now either. Really quick word for you.
Yeah, provinces have a huge role to play in this, in that they have relationships with different governors, senators, Congress. I think Florence Macaulay had a great relationship with Sonny Perdue, who's their Secretary of Agriculture, and those relationships help influence and get deals done as well.
Before I let you all go peacefully into 2020, I'm hoping that you might be willing to share your political New Year's resolutions. It can either be for you, Mr. Giz, or someone else you'd like to see. What is it?
I'm going to go quickly and add some in here. I would like to see all governments in Canada make evidence-based decisions. I know we've
that's a
got
barn burner.
a lot of minority parliaments and stuff, but I want to see that happen. For myself, I need more time on the treadmill. I'm running the Ottawa half marathon against my wife, and a win for me is to finish within...
You mean with your wife?
Yes. Well, against my wife. A win for me is to finish within 15 minutes of her. And finally, my last resolution is kind of a wish. Bob Rae's gone NDP. He's gone Liberal. There's 2 leaderships open now. I want him to choose between running for the Green or the Conservative leadership in 2020.
Mr. Rae, over to you. Your resolutions.
Well, like every other Canadian, I'm going to eat less and exercise more. But I am going to try to do something which I find has actually become harder for me, and that is to actually think more slowly and read. I find that the amount of info coming at me on Twitter and every other form of social media makes it hard to keep focused. So I'm going to just try to slow down a little bit and.
I like that.
No, I'm not running for the leader of any
Okay, so
political
you're
party.
not the next Green Party leader. Got it.
No, I'm good. I know this is going to cause massive disappointment.
It will.
In
Okay.
both those parties, but
Ms. Clark.
that ain't going to happen.
Speaking of, Ms. Clark, your resolutions.
Mine, I chair an organization called Roots of Empathy. It was founded in Toronto. It's the only place in the world where we have scientifically proven ability to stop and reduce bullying amongst human beings. My goal is to double the amount of fundraising for Roots of Empathy so we can double the number of children around the world who learn about kindness and how not to be a bully in classrooms. Because I want to live in a society that is more civil, that is more kind. I want to see workplaces where people support each other, where women and men and people of all backgrounds are not just tolerated, are welcomed and accepted. And that's where kindness lets us begin.
All right. Well, that's a good one. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much to our
Thank
former
you.
premiers this evening, Christy Clark, Bob Rae, and Robert Giz. Happy holidays to all of you, and thanks for being so generous with your time. It's been an excellent year with the premiers on Power and Politics. Happy 2020 to all of you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Kapellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.